Right, so hello. As I was saying, there is this new research that has come out which shows that the British financial elites in London and their networks around the world, including in America, actually conspired to bring about World War One as a deliberate policy to destroy Germany as a rival. Now, this should be subject to normal historical criticism and research, but if I was Professor of Modern History at Oxford, I would get some students to work on this and go through all the archives that these scholars have discovered, because it is quite shocking. The thing I found most shocking is that the British intelligence were in league with British financial interests and had penetrated Russian intelligence and the Russian Foreign Ministry. And the Russian Foreign Minister, Savinov, actually interfered to block a peace discussion between the Tsar and the Kaiser. The Tsar, Nicholas II, who was going to die within 3 years because of this catastrophe, tried at the last minute to stop World War One, and he sent a personal envoy from St. Petersburg to Berlin by train to personally eyeball the Kaiser with a secret message saying, "Dear brother, I don't want this war." And that would have stopped the war. And the most shocking revelation of this book is that Savinov, the foreign minister in the pay of the British, discovered this and had this man hauled off the train in St. Petersburg at the last minute as the train was about to leave, and thus World War One went ahead. Now, when I read that, I found that the most shocking revelation I've read as a historian. I mean, I have a PhD in history. I'm pretty, I know that people do skullduggery, but that my country, Britain, would have interfered to engineer the Russian foreign minister to haul that guy off the train to make sure World War One happened, given all the karmic consequences that flowed, millions of deaths in the most cruel and horrific circumstances. The Russian Revolution, which then led to millions of other deaths, and the Chinese Revolution, and then the rise of the Nazis as what do we do? World War II was a sort of repeat match. All that chaos hung on that guy being taken off the train. And I think it would make a great movie. I mean, a shocking, terrible movie, but as a peace thinker, I find that one of the most shocking things in this book, so I recommend it. But that's not all. There's another thing I want to share here, which I found equally poignant, sad, just, it makes me want to get Byron back into incarnation, writing poems. Only he could do justice to this, right? So Germany was hoodwinked into this war because Britain, through its control of Russia and France, because we also had agents placed in France, right? They prevented any peace treaty being done. The Kaiser was desperate to have peace, right? So no. And so the war was then like, it's going to happen. And the Kaiser was more or less bullied by his mechanized generals. You see, the thing is, in those days, war, for the first ever time, was now a mechanized affair. The Germans had developed troop trains, and they had a mass transportation plan to involve, the minute the war was declared, they would go over the frontier into Belgium by train, en masse. And the whole thing was mechanized. And it was triggered. And it was a plan which had been developed by the Prussian chiefs of staff, who were now the German imperial chiefs of staff, and two particular figures I've been researching this last week, who were basically behind this thing. And they were two figures, both with the same name, which is very confusing. Helmut von Moltke. Now, there was Helmut von Moltke the Elder, who lived from 1800 to 1891. He was the genius behind the modernisation of the Prussian army. He was a real interesting character. He knew Bunsen, the Prussian ambassador I was telling you about, and he was an intellectual among generals. He'd studied foreign languages, he travelled in Turkey, he travelled all over Britain. He loved Britain. He learned from, he was one of these intellectuals who studied war studies as like a passion. And he realised that the only way to win wars now was by using railways. The revolution of the mechanisation of war required mass mobilisation by railway. And it was him who invested in and built most of the German railway system, right, for military purposes. And so, anyway, it was his son, Helmut von Moltke the Younger, who had been bequeathed, because the old boy had died in 1891, the son was now in charge of the German military effort. And the Kaiser trusted him, and he was in charge of the war plans, which involved rapid mobilisation by train, invasion through Belgium into France, hitting northern France, telescoping France, and before you could blink, they'd be in Paris and the war be over. They wanted a repeat of 1870 invasion. And it was all to be done by train. It involved neutral Belgium getting clobbered, but that was the way they had to do it because they couldn't get through otherwise. That was what they thought. And the Kaiser, right up until the last minute, had second thoughts. He wasn't the bad man everyone makes out in history. I've been studying this, guys, you know. We were fed a whole bunch of porkies when we did the history of World War I in the University of London. There's a whole load of much more interesting stuff. The Kaiser was seriously having qualms about this, and it was a professor of moral philosophy at University College wrote a book called The Moral History of the 20th Century, which is a classic. I recommend it because I'm a philosopher and a historian. I'm interested in moral history. So this professor has a whole chapter on the Kaiser, and he points out the following, that the Kaiser eventually gave the order to declare war. And that meant immediate invasion of France by Belgium, right? Because the French were mobilising, the Russians were mobilising, that was the plan. Germany had to fight a war on two fronts, against Russia in the east and France in the west. And their plan involved knocking France out quickly so they could then take on the juggernaut of Russia. The Kaiser, and again, I think it would make an amazing movie, and I'm working on a script, was hesitant right up to that night. He signs the order at 10 at night. I don't know. And immediately telegraphs, the generals telegraph the front, and the troop trains roll immediately, like a minute later. It was all mechanised. And they cross the frontier, and we're talking thousands and thousands of armed German soldiers. They take over the local towns, they start shooting. The Belgians don't know what's going on. They fight back, and the Germans just fight back, and then there's a war. Right? The Kaiser, that night, woke up with a nightmare, and he called his top general, I presume it was Helmut von Moltke, and he said, "Helmut, I made a mistake. Stop the war. Bring the troops back." Right to the last minute, he was dithering. And he said, I've made a mistake. Don't declare the war. And what the general said is, Mein Kaiser, it cannot be stopped because they've crossed the frontier, it's railways, it's mechanised, it's out of our control. We can't pull back this juggernaut. The juggernaut has been unleashed. It's like, nowadays it would be as if you fired the nuclear missile on Moscow and suddenly Tony Blair says to the submarine commander, no, stop, bring the missile back. Sorry, it's too late. World War III has just been launched. That was what World War I was launched with. Anyway, that's something I learned from that study of the moral history of the 20th century, and it's haunted me ever since. Like how many millions of people died because of the moral weakness, actually, of the Kaiser. He should have, he should have stood up to the bullying of the... You see, it's the same bunch of people running the Pentagon and MI and Ministry of Defence is, we need all that billions spent on weapons because they've got them. It's the same military justification. The civilian, the emperor or the king or whatever, or the prime minister has to say, no, you do my bidding. I've said stop the war. You stop the war. That's it, And you can go and stand in front of the trains if you have to. But, it wouldn't have been impossible to ring the train guards and tell them to go back, But anyway, so then the next thing I want to share, which is, I think, so poignant. This is where Byron wants to write a poem. And Byron's great mystery, Cain, has him meeting Lucifer. Before Cain, this is one of Byron's greatest poems. It's never been publicised. You've never heard of it, right? Byron was a romantic philosopher like me and a poet, and he was a Europhile. And he does this poem, which is a play in Shakespearean type language, of Cain's murder of Abel, the first murder. And it's the fall of man, if you want. And it tells the story after the banishment from paradise of Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve. and Cain and Ada, Cain's wife Ada, and it's an amazing poem, and Lucifer is the key figure in it, because Lucifer has all the best lines, and it's a masterpiece. So anyway, fast forward. I'll come back to Lucifer in a minute. Helmut von Moltke, the Younger, unleashed his war plan. Belgium is invaded. The British send their little expeditionary force to try and help the plucky Belgians and the French, right? Belgium is defeated and surrenders, and then the German army comes down into northeast France, but gets bogged down at the Somme and the Marne, a river I know and love well. It's an old Druid river, the Marne. I've done peace prayers there. And there's bloody battles and so on, and eventually the invasion is stopped, and the combined British and French forces push the Germans back from the Marne, and they then dig in defensive lines. And we dig in defensive lines, and that becomes the trench warfare for the next 4 years, in which millions of people are going to die, machine gunned to death over a few hundred yards of muddy land, including my hero, colleague Robert Graves, who wrote Goodbye to All That About It All. He was wounded in the Battle of the Somme. He survived to become Professor of Poetry in Oxford. Fast forward, Helmut von Moltke said, when the Battle of the Marne was lost by the Germans, he said, Mein Kaiser, the war is lost. He knew everything depended on that rapid defeat of France. He knew Germany could not maintain this super war against Russia, against the West, and eventually against America when they came in, because Britain also could draw on Canada and the Dominions. Moltke knew the war was over, and he said that within a few months. Now, any intelligent Kaiser would have said, well, that's fine, I didn't want it anyway, let's just make a peace treaty. But stubborn, they hold on and they carry on with their war plans. Moltke then is sacked because, his plan hadn't knocked France out. And he takes the can, and he gets very sad and ill. He retires with his wife, and he dies 2 years later in 1916. Okay, this was a general of the son of the genius, who was a man of integrity. Now, what I've learned this last week, and I didn't know before, was he was a theosophist. He was a mystic. Old Helmut von Moltke, the Younger. He was a deep, deep thinker, and he didn't want the chaos that was unleashed by World War One. He took upon himself the karma of having unleashed it. You see, if they'd have managed to knock France out immediately, none of that further chaos would have happened. It would have just been, okay, that's like an 1870 repeat match. France lost. That's Germany 2, France 0. And the Germans would have gone home after a few months, and everyone would have got on with life. But because that failed and the trench warfare opened, it became, a war to the death of utter attrition and chaos. And so here you have poor old Helmut von Moltke the Younger dying in Germany, weeping because of the chaos he's helped unleash on the world. I mean, this is why I say to all my military friends, choose the path of peace before it's too late. Moltke, as a theosophist, knew the causes and consequences of what he was doing. Now, his wife and he were friends of Rudolf Steiner, who was the head of the German Theosophical Society in Berlin, and a highly intelligent man who'd studied Goethe. I used to be the librarian at Steiner House in London, and I have a lot of time for Steiner, although, of course, he got things wrong, he was a bit dated. But his book, Knowledge of Higher Worlds, and his spiritual seership are very important. And more is coming out all the time about how far in advance of his colleagues he was. And von Moltke was a friend of his. Now, what's very interesting, I've just discovered there's a book published by Rudolf Steiner Press, which, as I say, I used to be working at the Rudolf Steiner Bookshop and Press in Museum Street, opposite the British Museum in London. So I know these people. They've done something amazing. They've just published a book because after he died, Helmut von Moltke, the general, dying in 1916, he then contacted Steiner from beyond the grave. There was like a seance or a transmission. I'm not exactly sure how Steiner picked it up. And it was intended for Steiner and his wife. Von Moltke passed a message to humanity from beyond the grave. This is the general he's now gone to the afterlife. And you can read it in the book, which I strongly recommend, what he says. And I'll just read the exact quote. It's given in the book in detail, and it's definitely worth reading. The passage I want to quote you, which I think is so relevant to the discussion we're having today about Brexit and politics, right? Von Moltke says, amongst other things, complete truth no longer exists now anywhere on earth. It is untruthfulness which exists and shyly keeps away from scrutiny. Now don't forget, this is a disembodied transmission coming through, right, from the heaven worlds. Souls are full of deformed concepts. Were the spiritual world to intervene directly in the sense of a total change of course, a time of even greater materialism would follow. Lucifer, in particular, is working continuously to effect such a change of course in the wrong sense. End of quotes. Now, my jaw dropped when I read this. Just this last week, I've been studying World War I since I did my history, before I did my history degree, but in my history degree I did it in depth. I also studied it practically in Canada when I was in my 20s by nursing soldiers who'd fought in World War I. In the Colonel Belcher Hospital, I nursed old Canadian Army soldiers, and we got to be really close friends. I was the guy that helped them as their nursing orderly, and they told me their life stories and trusted me with what it was like in World War I. And I still remember one Scottish Canadian in particular called Colonel Bonthron, who was very proud of the fact his ancestors had been the vintners to King James of Scotland, King James I, Canadian in the army. And he was still in shell shock. He would sit on his bed at the age of 80 or whatever and say to me, wringing his hands, "Thomas, why did we fight that war? It made no sense. Go back to Britain and find out, and stop World War III, because that'll be even worse." And I took it as a mission when I went back from Canada. I could have had a lovely, easy life being some normal, conventional academic teacher in Canada, But no, I came back into the maelstrom of London and the Cold War to find out what caused World War I and how to stop World War III. So I'm still on mission here. And I find it shocking that I'd never been taught that poor old von Moltke was such a deep person, and that his concern for humanity continued even into the afterlife. Right? Well, in my doctoral thesis, I proposed the idea of transpersonal history, that maybe we should look at the history of spirituality as well as conventional history. Well, this is an example of transpersonal history. This is a general who was at the key centre of events at the start of World War I, saying from beyond the grave. And what is it he's saying? If you read that again, complete truth no longer exists now anywhere on earth. It is untruthfulness which exists. Now that goes to the essence of what I'm calling for, which is a truth bill for parliamentarians in Britain and in Germany and Europe and America, wherever. This is what I'm addressing, just as von Moltke did. Only I'm alive saying it, is we have to get people to realise truth is sacred. When untruth flourishes, we get world wars, like World War I with millions dying. Or we get, God forbid, goddess forbid, we get World War IIIs. We got World War IIs. It's all propaganda. It's untruth. It's ministries of misinformation. So I'm 100% agreeing with von Moltke in my Bremain manifesto. If the UK is to stay together, or Europe is to stay together, we will only do it on the basis of truth. And that means, well, you can talk about it negatively. It means, firstly, not lying. So truth is not lying, and that means being honest about what you know and so on. It's deeper because it means trying to share what you know as much as possible, as much as the person can understand. So the communication of truth is a moral duty on all of us, and I would say that to all my friends, colleagues. So yes, it is untruthfulness that exists and shyly keeps away from scrutiny. Again, that's what von Moltke says, and that's what we see in this Brexit campaign. We know these people have lied. Boris Johnson, so many times, it's all over the internet. Farage, they're lying, lying, lying. Dominic Cummings, lying, 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 but they shyly keep away from scrutiny. We're not allowed to see the details. Even the Crown Prosecution Service, the police, haven't been able to find out exactly how they lied. And this is wrong. I'm saying clean sweep, a new government, a new reforming government. I don't, to be honest, care if it's Labour or whatever. I think it has to be a coalition. The only way we will get these Tories out is if we all vote for truth. And that means voting for a reform alliance of all the progressive, reasonably honest parties. So by voting tactically, you vote, Plaid Cymru, where they Remain people. You vote for SNP in Scotland. You vote for Labour, where they've got the best chance of defeating the Tories. And you vote for Lib Dem when they do. And in Ireland, you vote for anyone that's standing, the majority on a Remain ticket. The SLP, the Alliance, and so on. I would love it if the DUP and the other Ulster Unionist Party would also join a reformed Remain alliance. Do they have any intellectuals left that can figure that out? I mean, they gave us C.S. Lewis and other great thinkers. Where are the intellectuals of Ulster? Somebody wake them up. Okay, so truth, therefore, is absolutely central to the strategy I'm saying. And as I say, I only just discovered this transmission from von Moltke this last week, and I wanted to share it because, to me, you see, we were taught it was all the Kaiser's fault and it was all Germany's fault, and von Moltke is the devil incarnate, and we hate the Huns, and then we hated the Germans even more in World War II because they're all evil and blah blah blah, and so this is what's paraded in the kind of Tory tabloid press against Europe is, well, they're all just Germans, we hate them, Folks, wake up, study your history, realise that these world wars are a catastrophe to everybody. And the German people suffered vastly, enormously in the end of World War I, which is what gave rise to the tragedy of them thinking that Hitlerism was the answer. That's as intelligent as people thinking Brexit is the answer to the social and economic problems of Britain. And it's not surprising that Brexiteers all love Hitler. They're coming from the same crazy, demented thought world. Blame the other, blame the enemy. Instead of do your homework, become enlightened, reach self-knowledge and come to love, which is the enlightened perspective I talked about, the liberal perspective in the highest sense. Now I want to come on and talk about another tribe. I've sort of saved this one to the last, really. I've talked about the tribes of the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh. Now I'm coming to talk about the Tories. You see, the Tories are a tribe in their own right. I've known many people that have voted Conservative. I've got friends who are Conservatives. Although I hope now they've left the party and realised that, you see, the true Tories party has been taken over by this Brexit mob of right-wing fanatics, led by Johnson, who's just a PR paper mache puppet. All the people of integrity, the old true Tories like Dominic Grieve, Hammond and all the others have all left. Amber Rudd, they had at least some integrity. So I want to tell you a story because the word Tory, it shouldn't even be applied to these people, because the word Tory actually meant an Irish resistance person that was fighting Cromwell and the takeover of his country or her country in the dark ages of the mid-1600s. When Cromwell sent this army in to persecute and destroy the Catholics of Ireland. It was for him a kind of religious war. And, as a peace person, I'm totally against religious wars. I'm for religious peace. I've written the Interfaith Peace Treaty, right? As I've told you, a Catholic Protestant, so I want to bring them together. Well, Cromwell was the opposite. He wanted to smash them. And he sent in his shock troops who just killed the Royalist army to go and terrorise Ireland. And so these poor Catholics who were defeated in battle after battle, they took to the woods. And they became called the Tories. which meant an Irish freebooter or rebel or like a Robin Hood figure. Now, when I went to Ireland, I've been many times. I once spent some time at a pagan retreat festival. We did 5 festivals. I think it was Lunacer actually, and we had some great druid, chats. And I was there as a peace envoy from the British Druid Council, and it was in fact the same year as the Good Friday Agreement of 1997. And I was told by these Irishmen that they were reclaiming the word Tory. They'd founded a thing called the Tribe of True Tories, who they regarded as the actual inheritors of the Tory tradition, because they were honest, decent, Irish folks in the underground, surviving, just as their ancestors had done. So I've met real Tories, okay? I've met the real Tribe of True Tories. They're different. They have honour, integrity, they're truth sayers, they have courage, they're good people. This lot in Westminster, this so-called Tory party, they don't deserve the title. They're, illegal manipulators of fake information and false data. Why has it come to that? Well, I think this Conservative Party has been hijacked, literally bought by the oligarchs that run the world behind the scenes. And I have to talk about the extremely wealthy. There is a circle of very, very wealthy people, and we're talking the kind of people that dangled Epstein. It's a sinister evil is the only word I can use for it. And when St. Paul said we're up against corruption in high places, he meant people like Epstein, who who think they're so rich they can just do whatever they want and get away with it. And normally they do. It's amazing that Epstein was actually caught in the end. And we've now seen Prince Andrew, he's part of that same international elite of the very wealthy that think they're beyond morality and beyond ethics. Extremely wealthy. And they essentially are the oligarchs who have basically bought the Conservative Party and have pushed it in the military war direction. So, bombing Syria with missiles from Theresa May's husband's family is all part of, it keeps it all in the family. Nuclear weapons up in my loch Goyle, yeah, fine, that's all part of our Tory policy, because you never know when we might have to fight World War III, so we need them, And as if they're prepared to mass destroy billions and billions of people in a nuclear war, So this Conservative Party have done Brexit under the influence of these rich oligarchs. Now this is factual. This has now come out. We know that there have been rich Americans behind it, rich people from offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, whatever. Follow the money, you find the origins of Brexit. Daily Telegraph owners, the people that run the Daily Mail, all their prints, the Express, Aaron Banks and his offshore accounts in the Isle of Man and so on. It's an oligarchy of very rich people that thought, in their fantasist illusory world, which has no bearing on reality, that Brexit's a good idea. Because they thought, well, we'll escape all this attempt by the European Union to crack down on offshore taxes. We'll escape all the kind of rigmarole they keep sending us, and to be regulated, and it's a sort of anarchical capitalist bid by that oligarchy. Now it includes Russian billionaires, as we've now learned. A whole series of Russian billionaires have literally funded the Tory party for the last 10 years or whatever. These are very rich people who've made billions in Russia in the energy markets. Then, shockingly, left Russia and come to live in London, bought up parts of Mayfair, and assimilated or infiltrated into the Conservative Party. These are people with no ethics and no sense of what Britain actually stands for. They think that just money matters, so they go and get the right shirts, they go to St James and Jermyn Street and buy all the right stuff and drive the right cars and all that, go to the right clubs. And on the veneer, it looks like they're assimilated to English values and culture, British culture. But the trouble is they have no morality and no sense of honour and integrity. They've trashed the poor of their own country, and I bleed for, the problems Russia's had. And now they're trying to buy influence and power in Britain, and nearly succeeding. You know, they figured out the best way is to just buy up the Tory party. They're that wealthy. Well, I'm saying, I don't know if there's any genuine Conservatives left out there, any good people that can understand what I'm saying. For Christ's sake, don't vote for this ramshackle, illegal caboodle that calls itself the Tory party. Don't vote for Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, you know. It's a self-suicide of our nation. Vote for the Lib Dems, who at least have a degree of integrity left, and who will, you know, steer the country with Labour and with the Greens and with the SNP in the right direction, and Plaid Cymru. They will be part of this rainbow alliance. And perhaps some of my Russian friends don't realise all of what I'm saying, you know, and this might come as a bombshell. You know, I'm not making an anti-Russian diatribe here. I love Russia. I've travelled in Moscow. I'm a philosopher who's been honoured by the Institute of Philosophy in Moscow. I have dear friends who run the Russian Philosophical Association. I'm speaking merely as a philosopher, warning my dear Russian colleagues, you know, that you've been barking up the wrong tree by backing this Tory party and Brexit. It's a catastrophe, and it's a total interference in my country's life, just as much as, you know, if I suddenly suggested that Moscow and St. Petersburg should have a war, and Petersburg and the north of Russia should secede from the rest of Russia. You'd think I'm bonkers, and you'd arrest me, right? Well, that's what you guys are doing in my country. So this nonsense, the Tories say, well, they're all British citizens, they can do what they want, you know, if they want to join the Tory party, that's great. No, there are consequences of all these things. And so what I'm saying is the authentic Conservatives need to stand up kind of, you know, within that party against them. And but I think it's lost in time of this election. So you've got to en masse vote for the Lib Dems. So the ignorance of these English Tories is shocking. Now, it's not only the oligarchs. There's, I suppose, really, you could say the Conservative Party represents the top 5% of British, you know, income bracket. So people with a couple of houses, 3 or 4 cars, villa in France, you know, couple of businesses, you know, and an income of at least 80 or 100 grand a year. Those would be the kind of people I'm talking about, Conservative types. Now, they'd be in the lower rank of the Conservative Party, but they still buy into the cultural trappings. They read the Daily Telegraph, Country Life, wear the green wellies, and like to be part of the establishment, part of the Conservatives. They go to Ascot. They you know, it's a cultural thing. It's chic to be part of that. And in the evening, they wear their nice woolly jumpers around the fire, and they buy them off the Telegraph. Well, wake up, people. You know, any proper Conservative who understands that it's not the trappings that make you a Conservative. It's your commitment to morality, to conserving what is good in life. That was what Edmund Burke said as an intellectual, who was Irish, by the way, saying, wake up, people. Remember that we are trying to save our culture from hubris. What this other Tory cabal have done, Boris Johnson and co., is they've taken us down the hubris route, which is British Empire, we can be the superb power, we don't need Europe, we're great and free, we're going to take over the world again, have British Empire Mark II, we're going to colonise everywhere that we want and have great, you know. Boris Johnson is just like a puppet of these megalomaniac oligarchs who think they can park their capital in Britain, like Dyson and co, and then build their factories in Malaysia and will do British Empire Mark III. They haven't realised that, you know, time has been called on this project with the departure of Scotland from the UK, and the whole house of cards is going to come crumbling down. So this Tory Brexit turns into the nightmare of the breakup of the United Kingdom in bitterness and you know, in hatred, actually.